G'day Jafffa Adventures, Terry King here. Welcome to the channel. Something completely different for the channel today. Have a look at what I've got here on this stand. For those who follow the channel, you'll know young Jacob and his 80 Series Landcruiser. What he's done here is he's bought himself a Sunvisor. Now, as I like to pull the Mickey out of Jacob, I'm not a fan of these. They, to me, are a real kind of an old man looking thing. But hey, the young fella likes these, and perhaps they're coming back in vogue, and maybe I'm just showing my age. Anyway, Jacob has mounted this up to his truck, and he absolutely loves the look of it. And I have offered to paint it for him. So this video is going to detail what I do to prepare this Sunvisor for paint, and we'll shoot some color on it, and then we'll get Jacob over here with his truck and get him to mount it up, and we'll have a look at what it looks like. And who knows, maybe he can convince me to mount a Sunvisor onto my 200 series, but not very likely. So do you want to have a look at the preparation and painting of this Sunvisor and the installation on an 80 Series Landcruiser? Stick around. Now, as I said in the intro, Jacob has already mounted this up, and the reason I asked him to mount it before it was painted was because if he had to do any panel beating or elongation of mounting holes or changing of brackets, that he got that all finished before we actually got paint on it. And he has mounted this up, and it's now in a position for me to be able to sand her back and shoot her with some color. You notice here a little bit of ugliness with some dents, etc. That's some of the work that Jacob had to do to actually get this thing to fit, and he assures me that a bracket goes over top of this, so he's not too concerned about how that looks. Now, I think on the front edge of this visor, this might actually be a chrome strip. It's got some tape on it, however, so I'm going to pull that tape off and have a look at that. And if the camera can focus, you can see that this tape is not actually go right to the edge of this chrome strip. So what that means is if I was to spray this now and then peel that tape off, you'd get a little bit of paint along that front edge there. And that's a little bit sloppy for me. So what I'm going to do is pull this tape off and see what we're dealing with underneath of it. Now I got myself a razor blade here, and I'll see if I can start this tape peeling. There we go. And that must be the mob that he bought it from. Highway Sunvisors on Alderley Street in Lidcombe, New South Wales. Sorry, Mr. Manufacturer sticker, but you're going to have to come off. And here's exactly what I was talking about. You can see a little bit of primer over the end of that chrome strip and all along this trailing edge, the entire length of that chrome strip. That's the attention to detail stuff that just really annoys me. So that's no good for me. I'm going to strip all of that off. Well, it appears as though they've just used a crappy old single stage primer on this thing, and that primer is coming off with a little bit of thinners. So that's awesome. That means I don't have to sand it off or scrape it off with a scraper. I can just wipe it off. Sweet! That's going to save me a lot of time, and it's not going to damage this chrome strip. Now we're looking at the underside of the visor here, and look at that. We got a little Australia made sticker. How cool. Unfortunately, little guy, you're going to have to come off. Now look at this. This is the underside of that chrome strip, and the tape that they had on it ended here. Not a fan of that either, so I am actually going to take all of this green paint off with a little bit of thinners, because luckily it does come off, and we'll take it right down to that edge. So this entire front lip will be a chrome strip, as I think it's meant to be. I did ask Jacob if he wanted the underside of this painted a matte black or a flat black. He said no, he'd prefer to have that the color of the car. So this entire thing, minus this front chrome strip on the front edge, will all be the color of the car. Some might ask me, why am I doing this? And I guess my motivations are a couple of reasons. First of all, Jacob is a young man starting out in his life's journey. He's been dealt a pretty crappy blow in that he lost his father within recent memory. Now, don't get me wrong, I am in no means trying to replace his father. I never could. I never would. I can't imagine how difficult it would be to lose your father. My father's still with me. But listen, if I can help a young man who's just starting out on his life's journey, then I'm certainly going to seize that opportunity. I guess the other reason that I'm doing this is somewhat selfish. By doing these sorts of jobs, I learn a little bit. Heck, I've never ever painted a sun visor before. I've never fitted a sun visor before. As Jacob will tell you very, very quickly, I'm not a real fan of what these things look like. So I probably never will have an opportunity to either fit this or work on anything like this. So from a selfish point of view, I'm learning something here, which is pretty cool. I'm not doing this for any money. Now I'm sure Jacob will try and bloody buy me a carton of beer or a bottle of whiskey or something like that. That's just the type of young man that he is, which is very generous, but that's absolutely not necessary, and it certainly has nothing to do with the reason that I'm actually doing this for him. So Jacob, if you're watching this video, keep your wallet in your pocket, mate. We're nearly there. I've just got myself a screwdriver now and this rag soaked in a little bit of thinners, and I'm just getting into some of the nooks and crannies that you wouldn't otherwise be able to get into. So I'll see you guys when I get this finished. Okay, I've got all of that paint cleaned off this now, both on the bottom side and on the top side. Next step will be to mask that up properly, and I want to make sure that I get that masking tape right up to that very edge and not have it either overlapping or underlapping. It needs to be dead straight on that edge. Now there's two ways I can do this, an easy way and a hard way. The hard way would be to run masking tape along that edge and eyeball it like so. And that works, but it takes a lot of time. You need a really good eye. I've got the time, but I don't have the eye. So the simple way I've found to do something like this is you just run your bit of masking tape there and you overlap it, and then you get yourself a razor blade or Stanley knife or whatever, and you just run it along that edge, then peel that up, and there you go. You got a perfect line. And that's the way I'm going to choose to do this. Alright, that's all taped up now, and there's that edge, razor straight, and that's exactly what we want it to look like. And on this front lip here, you can see that the tape's not balled up, or there isn't anything to deform the paint at all. And this is ready for sanding. I don't know what type of coating this is on here, but thinners takes it off quite easily, so it's probably a single stage, just a rust preventative. I've got 240 grit sandpaper and a sanding block, and I'm going to rough this up so that I can get my 2K high build primer to stick to this stuff. I just forgot, I'm going to throw some gloves on now because I don't want to get any more oil from my skin onto this panel now that I'm starting to peel off some of this coating and layers of coating on it. Alright, I've got that all sanded down with the 240 grit, and now I'm going to hit all of the surfaces that I paint with some wax and grease remover and pull off any of those fingerprints that I left behind or anything else that might be on this surface. I'm really careful not to bugger up that edge that I spent all that time taping down properly. I've taken my airline and blew all the dust out of it as well, especially in these little areas here where it might accumulate, sort of the little cracks and crevices that you can't get with a rag. All right, that panel is ready for some high build primer. We'll take some bolts and run it into the threads here so that I don't muck up those threads with the high build primer. Now I'll get my makeshift hook hanger, just wrap it around this bolt. That's ready to shoot. Okay, let's open up our high build primer. Oh my, that must have been sitting on the shelf a while because it needs a good stir. Okay, I've got my primer all mixed back up again. These cups here, these mixing cups are fantastic. There's no calculations or no guesswork. So this primer is a 4:1, 4 parts primer, 1 part hardener. And I don't know whether the camera's gonna pick it up, but it's got a little A and a little B. A is your primer and B is your hardener. So you fill the cup up to the A with your primer and you fill the cup up to the B with your hardener. And then there's 2 additional lines, which is 10% and 20% thinners, depending on whether you want to cut it back a little bit. So it takes all of the guesswork out of mixing 2-pack paint. I'm going to be spraying this high build primer with a 1.8 millimeter tip on the gun. And that's quite large. Normal paint tips are like 0.8, 0.9, 1.2, that sort of size range. But you need a larger diameter tip when you're spraying such a thick viscous solution. That's not too bad. I'll put a little bit of thinners in that, but not a lot. I'll probably go less than 10%. What I call a splash. You kind of got to use your experience when you're doing the mixing component of this, because it's the viscosity that you're after is going to be really dependent on your gun. And the way I check the viscosity is just the way that it dribbles off of the end of this ruler. And when you're done, whatever you do, don't stick that ruler back into your paint tin, because it's got hardener on it and it'll set that entire tin off on you. Clean my steel ruler off so I can use it as a ruler again one day. Now, I normally filter that through paper filter, but I'm not going to in this instance because I'm going to sand most of this hardener down, and I'm going to take a chance that it won't plug the tip of that gun if it picks up any gloops or blobs. Now here's just some cheap rattle can paint, probably $2 or $3 from the shops. And I'll use this as my guide coat. I prefer using a matte black because it doesn't clog the paper up as much as a gloss black. But gloss black's all I've got on the shelf, so it's got to do. That's it, all done. We'll just wait for that to dry and we can start sanding. Now my guide coat's all dry. I've got some 400 grit paper, and I'm just going to sand this all down until that guide coat has disappeared. And this is what I mean with the paper clogging up. That tends to happen with the gloss paint. You don't really see that too much with the matte black guide coat. When the paper does clog up, I can clean it up with a wire brush, or sometimes compressed air will take it off as well. I found that paper was just clogging up too much when I was sanding this dry, so I've converted over to wet sanding, and that's working beautifully. Paper's not clogging up at all on me. If I wipe this clean, you can see here these little dimpled areas. That's where the guide coat is sitting in, and I'm sanding this down so that all of those dimples disappear completely, and I've got a nice white surface. That tells me that this thing is completely flat. Right now I'm using 400 grit, and I'll step it up to 600 when I'm finished this, and I'll explain why when we get to that point. Now I've sprayed a guide coat on the inside of the Sunvisor, and I'm doing the exact same thing now, sanding that guide coat off. And it's actually probably a little bit more critical to get a good flat surface on this side of the visor, because when you're in the car, this is the side that you see. You can't really see the top side. Regardless, I'll sand this dead flat on both the top and the bottom. Here we have it. You can see that is sanded down completely flat now. There is no hint anywhere of our guide coat, and that's true on both sides. So that's been sanded down with 400 grit. I'm now going to go over it one more time with 600 grit. And the reason I'm going to use 600 grit is that there's metallic paint going onto this thing. And what happens with the 400 grit scratches, I know they're tiny, but the metal flake can actually sit up on edge on some of those 400 grit scratches. So by hitting it with 600, I'm closing those scratches down so that those metal flake will lay flat and you get the maximum sort of reflectivity out of the thing. All right, I got my 600 grit, nice quality 3M paper, and let's go to town and give her a once over with the 600 grit. It's a little bit tougher to tell when you got all the 400 grit scratches out because you're not using a guide coat now, but you can actually feel the paper kind of change a little bit. When it's pulling the 400 grit scratches out, it drags quite heavily, and when it gets down to a 600 finish, it starts to glide. So you just gotta be one with your paper. Who would have thought that sanding could be so zen? Finish sanding with 600. I'll just squeegee the water off. We'll let this dry thoroughly, and we'll hit it with some wax and grease, and then move on to paint. That's the sanding block that I'm using, by the way. It's a dual density, which means one side's kind of squishy and the other side's kind of firm. Comes in pretty handy for stuff like this. Wax and grease remover, and give this a nice wipe down. I'm going to mix up my color now. This particular paint coat is 3H4. And it's that metallic red Toyota color. Base coats are single stage paints, which means that you don't need to put a hardener in there. So this will simply be getting some thinners, and it's about a 50-50 mix of reducer and paint. Just like the high build primer though, we'll check the viscosity before we spray it. There's 250 ml there. I'll take it to 450 ml first, and I'll check the viscosity. And if I need to thin it out a little bit further, then I'll go up to that 500 ml. That actually looks pretty good there. I think I'm going to hold the phone on the reducer and spray that like it is. Now for this, we will strain it. I don't want to have any lumps in the paint or anything that's going to muck up what we're dealing with. All right, that's all strained. Let's go shoot some color. I'll just wait for that to tack off, and I'll check it by touching this masked surface. All right, that's dry. Let's hit her with a second one. There's our base coat laid down. No clear coat on it yet. Waiting for that to flash off, about 20 to 30 minutes. And then we'll hit it with some clear. Okay, now it's time to hit it with some clear coat. Exactly the same. This is a 2-pack clear coat. So we hit up to the A mark with clear coat, up to the B mark with hardener, because it's a 2:1, and we use this 2:1 column here. You couldn't make these things more simple. There's our clear coat. Next, our hardener up to the B line. Now we'll stir that up and check that viscosity. Just a wee bit on the thick side. I'm going to give that about 10% thinners. Now that first coat is a pretty light one, and I just want to get that tacky so that it actually acts almost like sticky tape. And once that tacks off, then I can hit it with a little bit more volume and a little bit more veracity. Okay, clear coat is all done on that side, so this side is finished. Now we can pop him up on end to do the top side. Well, that's a little bit of a bummer. See that little bit of a crazed area there? This is base coat only. I haven't hit this with clear coat yet. I got another little tiny spot there, and I've got some here. So having pondered this a little bit more deeply, I think I know what happened here. In these areas, I sanded through my high build primer down to the primer that was sitting underneath of it, which came from the manufacturer. And as we know, that primer is soluble in thinners, because I wiped that paint off this chrome strip with thinners. So what I think has happened is the thinners in the base coat has gone through, solubilized that coat that was underneath of it, and then obviously started to do this crazing. So the solution there is sand that back to bare metal, hit it with my epoxy primer again to seal it, and then don't sand through that epoxy primer. I'll still wet sand the epoxy primer to level it out and lay it flat, but don't sand through anywhere, because if you do, you'll expose that primer underneath, and I'll get this world of craze hurt again. So what I've got is a little bit here on the edges, one piece right there, and a little bit here on the edges. Now, because I've already painted the inside of this, I'm going to mask this completely off, because I don't want to get any overspray on the inside, because that's done, that's dusted. I'm pretty happy with how that laid down too. It's nice and flat, and the gloss is good, and there's not a lot of crap in there either for a back shed paint job. No spray booth here. Alright, I got myself some 500 grit wet paper, and we'll sand this little sucker down. Beautiful. That's all it's going to take. That crazing is all filled in. I'll hit that with the epoxy primer. Okay, I've got my entire panel sanded down again. All of these crazed marks have been sanded flat. So next step is to mix up a little bit of epoxy primer and hit these spots with the epoxy primer and seal that stuff so that I don't get that crazing again. I sanded this entire panel down, all of it, not just the areas where the crazing is, but the whole thing with 500 grit. When I'm done spraying these and the epoxy sets off, I'll flatten those with 500 grit and I'll go over the panel one more time before we're getting ready to put the new coat of base coat down. Okay, let's get some wax and grease, clean this off, and go prepare some epoxy primer. I got my pattern air screwed down so that I don't get a big fan. I get a more concentrated hit. It ain't gonna take much. I gotta wait for that to set up before I can sand it, so I'll wait for 24 hours. So the entire panel needs to be sanded down, but obviously the focus areas that I've got is where I had burnt through to that original base primer. That looks good. I can't see any crazing underneath there, so I think we're on to a winner here. I just gotta make sure when I sand this, I don't cut through it again. It's the following day. I've now sanded down those areas where I had the high build primer, and that's all looking pretty good. I didn't sand through to the base primer, which is what I was trying to avoid, so we're all good. I'll hit this with a bit of wax and grease remover. I'll go back to the base coat, clear coat. All right, it's color time again. Well, there she is with the color laid down and the clear over top, and it's come up pretty darn good. The clear's laid down nice and flat. I'll just leave that in the sun for a couple of hours, let that fully cure off. Now that I've got that clear coat done and laid down beautifully, I'm going to sand it off. Now you're probably saying, what the heck? Have a look at the reflection of the trees in there. There's not orange peel in this, but there is inconsistencies in the clear coat, and there's little pieces of crap as well, because I've obviously shot this in the outdoors in the shed. So I'm going to wet sand this clear coat down and get this to a mirror flat finish. Now I'm going to start off with 1000 grit paper, and that's because the clear coat is laid down pretty nicely and flat. If there was a significant amount of orange peel in this, I'd probably start off at 800 and work my way up from there. I'm not applying very much pressure at all. I'm just sort of letting the paper do the work. And the clear coat has kind of got like a little, I don't know, like a little film on it. But as soon as you break through that film with the paper, you can really start to feel it bite. And we'll see how well it's taking this clear coat off once I dry this panel. I'll show you. Let's see what we're dealing with. Just let that dry off for a second. And here's what we've got. See a little bit of wrinkling here. That's still yet to be sanded down. A little bit of wrinkling along the front edge. But this area here, for example, that's completely flat. So I'm not going to hit that with any more 1000 grit. That's as far as I'll take that. Okay, we'll call that done at 1000 grit. I now have a bit of 1200 grit. And there's still a little bit of area here that hasn't been sanded down. You don't need to take these all down with your coarsest grit paper, because you are going to run through some finer grits. That's pretty close. So that 1200 is going to pull that down, I have no doubt. So same thing, sand over that entire panel with a 1200 grit. The idea is I want to get those 1000 grit scratches out of here. All right, I think we're going to call that with the 1200. I'll squeegee this off and have a look what we got. It's a nice day to be color sanding because it's cloudy and it's breezy as well. So the panels dry off quickly and I'm not sweating my ring out. That looks pretty bloody good. We'll call it quits with the 1200 and I'll move on to 1500. All right, I got myself a piece of 1500. We're going to do the exact same thing. See how quickly that new paper is biting? You can see that milky color coming off straight away. Now normally I would move on to 2000 here. Unfortunately I don't have any 2000 paper, so I'm going to jump from 1500 to 3000. Not really what I want to do, but you've got to make do with what you got sometimes. What it means is I'm going to have to spend a lot more time on this panel getting those 1500 grit scratches out with 3000, whereas if I jumped to 2000 first, it'd be a lot easier process. Now I finished my first pass with 3000 grit, squeegeed off to have a look at whether I've missed anything. And what I'm looking for are linear scratch marks from my sanding block, because the orbital sander with the 3000 will take all those linear scratches out. And I can see that I've got a couple along this edge, which isn't surprising because I try and avoid those high spots. So I'll go over this panel once again, concentrating on those areas to get those linear scratch marks off before we move on to a buff. Okay, that's looking really good. I got all the linear scratches out of there. It's starting to get a little bit of a sheen to it with the 3000. It's now time to get the buff out and buff this clear coat to an absolute gloss finish. The first polishing compound I'm going to use is this Phoenixa. It's called a one-step, but I actually do use another compound after this one. And I'm just using that on a pretty soft foam pad with a bit of water. So I just soak the pad down in a little bit of water to keep it moist. Now unfortunately the handle's broken on my polisher, so I've got to do this a little bit more of a manual way, I guess. Put them the brakes. I'm just going over one single area until my pad dries out and the compound's buffed off. Then I re-moisten the pad and I move on to my next area. Okay, you could quite easily call it quits here. We got a brilliant shine there. There's no scratch marks or swirl marks whatsoever. It's a beautiful flat finish. But we can take it that one step further. I'm using this UF, which stands for ultrafine 92 compound, and that's a polish. And I'm using that on another one of these buffs, but this buff is a really soft foam compared to the last one. Same deal, put a bit of water down, put some compound down, and buff it out. This stuff goes a long way. I polished my 57 Chevy with that. I polished a full 55 Chevy. I polished Matt's XW wagon. So you don't need a lot of this stuff and it goes a long way, but my goodness, when it's finished, well, you'll see what I'm talking about. Throw a bit of compound down. How's that for bead porn? Well, we're going to take it one step further and throw a bit of ceramic coating down on it as well. Now I'm just going to throw a little bit of this Smothers CMX ceramic coating down. So they say just spread it around and work it into the paint. Let it dry, buff it off. Bob's your uncle. You be done. Now I had to move under cover because it started raining on me. Alright, there is our finished product. And if you have a look at the reflections of the leaves in the trees, you can see the shadow of the shed pole there, and you can see how it's got a really crisp edge. And that's what wet sanding does. It takes all of those imperfections out, gives you a complete flat finish. And that's the benefit of wet sanding your clear coat down. It gives you that mirror flat finish. If you go to car shows and you see a car where the paint really pops on it, I guarantee that they've wet sanded it. Alright, let's pull this tape off and we're done. Jacob will be around tomorrow and we'll fit this up to his car. Hopefully he likes the finished product. Okay, now we have to peel this tape off ever so gently. There's our finished product. Tape's all peeled off, ready to be installed in the car. Looks pretty bloody good. That's the top side, obviously. And that's our underside, which I have not wet sanded. That laid down quite nicely. There comes young Jacob now. I think he wants a sun visor. That'll do, bud.
Holy dooly, that's awesome. Wow.
Come up all right, eh?
Yeah, that's come up awesome. Ooh, look at the glass on that. Show car. Oh, awesome. Thank you, Jerry.
What that does mean, of course, is now that you got to do your whole car, right?
That's right. Well, I mean, I haven't been meaning to do it.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay.
Because, you know, I had to, like, trim this and that side, and then I had to bend those brackets a little bit.
Yeah.
But when it's on, you won't even notice any of that. Right. This is loose at the moment, so we can get the visor in. Top side of the visor is hard on there, and then it sort of, it shouldn't scratch, but there's like a little gap if you put your finger in there. That little gap between this chrome and this here, and it pushes in there.
Right, okay.
The short bolt out of the two will go on the bottom.
Could you pick up the bolt?
You mean this one just here? Just out of reach?
And the washer's just in under.
Hey there! How's that?
In and holding it, it's not going to slide away.
How you're talking so funny?
Where are you?
What's that, mate? A bit of perspiration.
A bit of perspiration. I was worried about that top bolt.
Yeah. See ya.
That's a Landcruiser handbrake for you. I don't use it. Awesome.
Nice one, mate. Nice one. Well done.
Thank you. No, thank you.
No, it's good. My pleasure.
Awesome.
My pleasure.
I bought it from a place called Highway, H-Y and then Way. They're at Rockley. They're a truck company, I think, as well. Because obviously visors are pretty big on trucks.
Yeah.
And it was just under the 400 mark. And that wasn't painted.
Yeah. Well, mate, you just, you're about 30 years behind me in age, but you just bloody caught up, I reckon.
Yeah, I'm going straight to the retirement home now. Just park up. Maybe if I'm lucky, the boys there will wash it for me.
Good stuff.
No, awesome.
All right, well done, dude.
Thank you,
Nice
Terry.
one. My pleasure. See you, boys.
See you, Terry.
Getting black shit all over my yard.
Lucky you're mowing it.
See ya.
See ya.